Well, hello there, and welcome to Book-ramble. This is another tag. I was tagged by Phillip Hall at A Poet Reads to Write, who himself was tagged by, and I'll read his words, the irrepressible and effervescent Julie at Bookish Travels. And Julie came up with a wonderful video recently in which she was filming herself from different strange angles. It was brilliant on the park bench. And it's non-fiction book tag. So thank you, Philip, and thank you, Julie, and I hope that I do this justice. So here are my answers to non-fiction book tag. There's 8 questions, and the first one is, what motivated you to pick up your first non-fiction book, and can you remember it? Can't remember it. Not a book, anyway. Non-fiction. One of the first memories I have was at school, and I loved history. A lot of us loved history because the teacher was Miss McClintock, Irish lady, always wore green, and all the boys would sit at the front, desperate to get her attention. And she gave out, well, certainly to myself, I'm assuming to everybody else, copies of National Geographic. And this would have been the early to mid-70s, and of course a lot of it was dealing with the Vietnam War. And I loved it. Non-fiction, I suppose. But as to a book, I think it must have been something along the lines of a general history book. But I just can't remember. So, terrible answer. Question 2. How do you choose your next non-fiction read? Recently I've come up with the idea of the best book, non-fiction or fiction, from the years 1946 to now, and each year choosing one book. And what would it be for 1946? The war had ended. And I looked it up, and it was a book by Viktor Frankl called Man's Search for Meaning. Now, Viktor Frankl was an Austrian psychologist. He was interned in Auschwitz and other camps. He survived. And he wrote very quickly, it turned out. It came out in 1946, as I said. And I said, I'd love to find that. So I went online, and there are some websites for New Zealand. None of them had that book. And I looked at Amazon and blah, blah, blah. I finally tracked down one website that was prepared to ship to New Zealand. It may have been, in fact, Amazon. And the book was coming from Germany, so I ordered it. Weeks later, I got this alert saying, unfortunately, it's not been sent, it's not arrived, and I got my money back. It was obviously someone's put up, they had this book, and then they didn't have it. And I thought, I was gutted. Perhaps I'll never be able to get this book. So I said, I'd love this book. I'd just love to find it. And I went into my local bookshop in Matakana. Lovely bookstore. And I went to the back, and on its own, looking at me, at a reduced price. Did I choose this book to read, or did the book choose me? I don't know. Make of that what you wish. Viktor Frankl. Fantastic book. Absolutely amazing book. He writes so presciently and precisely about events. It's a wonderful, in fact, introduction that he wrote in the 90s. He must have been a very old man by then, if it was him. And he talks about the stages that psychologically anybody would go through in that situation, from shock to apathy and so on. And I'm loving it. And in fact, I'm going to do an episode on it. Apologise. There's my notes I'm starting to make. No, I'm not going to apologise for that. It's good to make notes. So this is the kind of writing. The prisoner of Auschwitz in the first phase of shock did not fear death. Even the gas chambers lost their horrors for him after the first few days. After all, they spared him the act of committing suicide. So this is not a pleasant book to read, but it has great worth. And he is a psychologist. He talks about the need for scientific detachment, which in itself has some issues. But does a man who makes his observations while he himself is a prisoner possess the necessary detachment? Such detachment is granted to the outsider, but he is too far removed to make any statements of real value. Only the man inside knows, although his judgments may not be objective. Brilliant book. Yeah, so I chose it, but then I'm thinking, I'm not sure if I did. Question 3. Do you take notes or annotate your non-fiction books? I think I've already shown that. And unfortunately, yes, I do. I mean, I've said that almost every tag now. I murder books, and I'm no longer afraid to say so. It's engaging with the text, and I encourage anybody to do so. It makes it a living document to do so. It's not just ink on a page that you did not create. You're engaging with the ideas by doing so. So yeah, absolutely I take notes and annotate non-fiction books to death. I'm becoming a shameless plugger of my own work here. If somebody bought this and they wanted to annotate it, I'd be delighted. 4. Have you read a non-fiction book that has challenged your beliefs and assumptions? Absolutely. Quite a few have challenged my, well, it says beliefs. Any book that's history has challenged my assumptions. So I don't have a copy of this particular book. I'll show it now. Mein Kampf. I love history. I love World War II history. And because I have an interest in Operation Barbarossa, the Eastern theatre of operations, in other words, the Nazi attack into Russia, where really the Second World War took place, and the fight back in 1943, specifically when the Russians started to attack what was known as the Kerch Peninsula and Novorossiysk. Just love that old theatre, and I love reading about it. And through that interest of also the British forces in the war and so on, eventually I began to look at the reasons why the war started, and you look at the rise of the Nazi Party in Germany and so on. Through Spartacus, which is a brilliant website, they mentioned Hitler and his book Mein Kampf, written while he was in prison. And he actually wrote 2 books. One wasn't published, but Mein Kampf was in his lifetime. Terrible book. I've read it twice. What's interesting is that book, although it challenged my assumptions, it never made me a Nazi. You know, you can have detachment from that. But it made me question why certain people fell for what Hitler was peddling, and so on. Still does. But it was a real challenge. But throughout my life, the ones that I think I've been challenged the most, and I'm obsessed with, are these. I'm not religious. I believe that there's a God. I just do not follow any one religion. And all of these books are just fantastic to go through and make notes, question my misunderstandings, especially when it comes to scripture. And funny enough, I remember listening to Christopher Hitchens, who obviously wrote God Is Not Great. He hated the idea of religion. But he did say that when he was at school, one of the best lessons he ever learned was through religious studies. So that the teacher would give them a quote from the Bible, and they had to read it, and then write an essay making sense of what led up to that, and then what was the after effect. So in other words, source analysis. There's 4 ways in which you can read scripture. The surface level, it's called pardes. So peshat was the surface level, there really was an ark. Then there is remez, that it's a hint of something else, it may be the Ark of the Covenant. Then there is derash, it's like a homily, which a lot of religious pastors will take out as something like for a sermon. And then sod, the anagogical, the deeper meaning, the spiritual meaning that's beyond religion. So, for instance, the Ark could talk about guardianship. It's the protection of the planet. And it's a story that, to the ancients, was used to get their attention and make sense, and so on. Because of that, it's taught me that when you're reading stuff like this, there is the surface level, but then there's also those other layers underneath. What's it hinting to? What kind of a meaningful message could you take out of this? And what is the spiritual side? You know, man's endeavor to withstand, and woman, to withstand torture and oppression and so on. So I was challenged very early on by making sense of Scripture. I mean, this is the King James Version, and a lot of people who are into the King James will read it literally, no other level. And the challenge is understanding that. And it's the same for any book that you choose to read. So Norton Anthology, there are things in there that effectively you need to challenge yourself to understand, or Frankenstein, what's the real meaning? How was Mary Shelley's own childhood and the death of her mother? How does that influence the text? When the creature is talked about being yellow, sallow, and almost like horrible to look at, cold to the touch, does that refer to any of the dead children that she had to go through as a mother, and so on? Modern verse. How do you make sense of what's being mentioned here and written about? Actually, they talk here about poetry, a modern verse, that every child is a poet from the age at which he or she learns to beat a silver spoon on the table in numbers. And the rhythm of the text and what it means and the deeper meaning, all of that I've learnt by being challenged in the past and still continue to do so. But none more than this, because I'm not religious. So why is it that there are billions of people on the planet that are either Jewish or Christian and are? And am I missing something? And so on. Five, how do you feel about the intersection of storytelling and factual content in non-fiction? Well, I've done this a lot in my own books, to the fact that a lot of people have criticised it. So if you want just a dry account of events of, say, battles and the Royal Navy in the Age of Sail, you don't want a first-person's account of somebody who's on a ship, like a novel, because it's not what they are used to. It's unexpected. It's a blending of styles, especially as I use a lot of stream of consciousness, that some people don't like. Many do, but people don't. And therefore, I'm more than happy to have that intersection of storytelling and factual content, because history is telling tales. Science is telling a story. If you're going to talk about, for instance, the theory of relativity, yeah, you can give dry scientific account. But if you made it so it's like a story of how, for instance, Isaac Newton came up with his propositions and so on. If you tell it as a story, it's much more engaging, I find. It's not so dry or flat. So I'm all for it. I actually think it's a fantastic thing, and more should be done like it. It's out, especially in history. History used to be tales, not just dry accounts with maps and arrows going across it, which you get a lot, unfortunately, in history. So yeah, 5, very much for it. 6, is there a topic you wish authors would explore? Well, there are authors pretty much exploring everything, but I would love to see the breakdown, the rigid breakdown in non-fiction of things that people think have to be done in a certain way. So, we're human, we're physical. Yeah, we can see that. And we can prove our physicality, that we live in 3 dimensions, and that those 3 dimensions are us. But we know that we also live in a 4th dimension. We go through time, even though in itself time does not exist. When is it new in outer space? But there's also other dimensions that are often not talked about in non-fiction books. And that is the mind, the soul, the spirit. We can't prove that we have them, but we know we have them. They're non-physical. But often our thoughts, if our thoughts can make us happy, they can also make us ill. And I would love, especially in medical journals, for breaking down this rigid, you can only talk about the physical, but also bringing in the non-physical aspect of ourselves. Seeing ourselves holistically as beings with a non-physical side. And in fact, often the non-physical side is our most important, because it's where our memories are and our thoughts and blah, blah, blah. Well, I'd like to see that explored more. And potentially, I think we're on the cusp of where it is starting to do so. And I hope that makes sense. 7, do you incorporate insights from non-fiction into your daily life? Yeah, all the time. Absolutely. Well, again, it depends on what non-fiction book you're reading. Non-fiction, especially with history, if I think about it. You know, there's the old saying that those who do not study history are doomed to repeat it. And boy, is that true. So there's a lot of parallels in the past with now. And if people studied it, it will inform their opinion of now, and it will inform their daily life. Does it mean you're better? Does it mean you can chortle at people who don't understand that what we're doing is exactly what we did 50, 60, 80 years ago? But it does make you aware, and probably a bit more open-minded and curious. So I've said before about epistemic vice and epistemic virtue. So epistemology, episteme is how we learn. Well, if you're not curious, you're going to be closed to counter-narratives. If you're closed to counter-narratives, you're very easily misled by people who will treat that gullibility and misinform you. But if you are open to study and open to insights from non-fiction, it will make you curious and therefore more aware of, or certainly more guarded with how you should feel about certain aspects. 8, choose just one book from your non-fiction collection to highlight. Well, I've already done that, and it will be this one. It's just fantastic. It's like everything. My favourite book is always the one I'm currently reading, and I'm spending some time with this non-fiction. There are others, so this is not non-fiction, but again, I'm reading Pride and Prejudice. But with this one, this is definitely one worth highlighting, because we put people to their lowest possible place on earth, and some survived. And what they tell us has to have great meaning. So it's definitely worth the effort, definitely worth getting. Beautifully written. Tag some people. Again, I will tag people, but I don't know who that is at the moment. As soon as I've edited it and put it up, I'll tag as well. So Phillip, and by extension Julie, thank you very much. It's a fantastic tag, because I love non-fiction, and it's just so nice to have it out there in the bookery world. As Frankl says, when we are no longer able to change a situation, we are challenged to change ourselves. And that's the benefit of non-fiction. So, thanks for listening. Ta-ta for now.